Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for taking the time to join us so early this morning. My name is Paul May. I'm Head of Communications at Climate Analytics. We're a global science and policy institute working to support and accelerate climate action around the world. Today, we're presenting findings from our latest brief, 2030 Targets Aligned to 1.5, evidence from the latest global pathways. The study applies sustainability and feasibility constraints to the two global pathways to distill key 2030 energy and emissions targets for the international community. Claire Fyson, our co-head of policy at Climate Analytics, will first introduce our findings for renewable energy and outline what they mean for a potential global renewables target in the run-up to COP28. Then Dr. Neil Grant will talk through how quickly global fossil fuel production needs to decline this decade and what these targets mean for global emissions. After which, we'll have time for your questions. I'll hand over now to Claire.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. At COP26 in Glasgow, countries committed to revising their NDCs to bring them in line with 1.5, but they failed to do so. We're now a third of the way through this critical decade for climate action, and the international community needs to urgently close that 2030 ambition gap. To galvanize collective action, we need clarity on how fast the world needs to move in key areas. We know a big part of this story will be in renewables. Earlier this year, we saw Germany come forward with a proposal for a 2030 renewable energy target to be part of the cover decision at COP28. The EU has now agreed that it will be pursuing this as a group, and the COP28 president has voiced his support. The big question is, what should this target be? Our analysis shows that wind and solar capacity need to increase by a factor of 5 to reach 10 terawatts by 2030. That's up from 2 terawatts today. Renewables altogether needs to make up at least 70% of total electricity generation by 2030, more than doubling today's share of around 30%. It's useful to look specifically at solar and wind because these are the technologies that will really drive the transition. They make up about 90% of the new renewable generation out to 2030 that we'll see. Our analysis shows that in 2030, we need to be adding at least 1.5 terawatts of additional wind and solar capacity every year. That's 5 times the 0.3 terawatts of wind and solar capacity that we've added between 2021 and 2022. The good news is that we have seen a very rapid acceleration in the growth of solar and wind in the last few years. The IEA's projections suggest that we could see a record increase in wind and solar capacity of over 0.4 terawatts this year. This acceleration needs to be more or less sustained to get to a level of 1.5 terawatts per year by 2030. And of course, support should be targeted at lower income countries where growth rates are currently slower due to, for example, a lack of finance, high capital costs, and other barriers. What sets our analysis apart from others is that we use a wide set of scenarios to derive these numbers, which are produced by several different models, all with different underlying assumptions. The scenarios we use were assessed by the IPCC in its influential 6th assessment reports, which contained a wealth of information on how to tackle climate change. Not all of the scenarios assessed by the IPCC are compatible with the Paris Agreement, and using such scenarios to guide the global energy transition could undermine attempts to set robust 1.5 aligned targets. So we selected a subset of scenarios from the IPCC database that are compatible with the Paris Agreement's 1.5 temperature goal. In this set, we excluded scenarios that rely on risky levels of carbon dioxide removal. We also focus on scenarios that show faster emissions cuts in high-income countries and discarded any from before 2018 to ensure that the most recent cost estimates for renewables are featured. Our final set of 24 scenarios don't rely on excessive amounts of future carbon dioxide removal and therefore require faster emissions cuts over this decade. And that means faster cuts in fossil fuels. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Neil Grant, who will set out our fossil fuel and emissions targets for 2030 and how they were derived.
Thanks, Claire. So the other half of this story is a fossil fuel phase-out. We can and should ramp up renewables as fast as we can, but if we don't also phase out fossil fuels, then emissions will continue to rise. This is a really big issue this year with the COP being hosted by a major fossil fuel producing country. And we've seen that vested interests and continued fossil fuel subsidies mean that the deck remains unfairly stacked in favour of fossil fuels. And this is delaying the progress that we urgently need. Based on our set of Paris-compatible scenarios, our analysis finds that the world needs to cut fossil production by 40% over this decade compared to 2020 levels. Coal goes the fastest, with a reduction of 79% because it has such a high emissions intensity. Looking at an annual basis, this means cutting fossil fuel production by 6% per year. But instead of this, fossil fuel use grew 6% from 2020 to 2021, and we're seeing the fossil production resuming pre-pandemic growth rates. This continued growth in emissions is adding more and more pressure onto what needs to happen this year and every year in this critical decade. I should emphasize that our findings are for a reduction in total fossil use, not fossil fuel emissions. Despite attempted assurances by some governments and the fossil fuel industry that future deployment of carbon capture and storage means we can keep using fossil fuels for longer, it's risky to assume large amounts of this expensive technology will materialize. Contrary to these narratives, we find that CCS has at best a minimal role to play. We looked specifically at the power sector and found that fossil fuel power generation with carbon capture and storage makes up only 0.1% of electricity generation in 2030. Even by 2050, less than 1% of global power generation comes from fossil fuels with CCS. Our analysis takes out risky scenarios that rely on very high levels of future carbon dioxide removal to look at only those which are compatible with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees in a sustainable manner. And the results do not look promising for the future of fossil fuels. These renewable and fossil targets together are critical for achieving the rapid emissions cuts that we need to see this decade. We find that the world needs to cut emissions by at least 8% per year to halve emissions by 2030 compared to 2019. This is faster than the 43% reduction highlighted by the IPCC, and that's in order to significantly reduce the need for future carbon dioxide removal. We also find that the global methane pledge needs to be strengthened from 30% to at least 34%, and that methane cuts need to happen twice as fast in the energy sector, by at least 66% in 2030. Now, every month of delay in climate action makes achieving these targets harder. There really is no time to waste in aligning national targets and policies with the 1.5 degree limit. There remains a huge gap between current targets and 1.5, and so the call made at COP26 to revisit and update 2030 NDCs to align with 1.5 remains as urgent as ever, and is a key ask on the road to COP28. Global targets cannot replace improved targets at the national level, that should be very clear, but they can set an important goalpost for the international community to rally round.
And we'll now open the floor for your questions. So if you'd like to raise your hands and give your name and tell us where you're from, that would be fantastic. Yes, thank you.
Hi, Urmi Goswami from the Economic Times. I had a question, sorry I missed the beginning, but I had a question about the phase out, the percentages that you gave and how coal needs to lead. I mean, in science there can be no quibble, but in real life and given the way energy source dependency is, fossil fuel, coal being mostly used in the global south, I'm wondering how do you match this requirement with practicalities, not just in terms of equity, but actually doing it?
Thanks for your question. I think what we see is that renewables are really ready to drive the transition. If we see how the cost of renewables has fallen, the cost of solar fell 85% over the last decade, and so similar cost reductions in batteries and other key low carbon technologies. And so that means these technologies are undercutting fossil fuels on price in many areas in the world, and they are ready to drive the transition. But you're right that there are some key barriers to their deployment and to accelerating a fossil phase out in developing countries. That's particularly around the cost of capital that these technologies are facing and the level of climate finance. So the way to make this transition that we're calling for here feasible is around accelerated climate finance from the high-income countries. That's, yeah, we'll need that acceleration in finance in order to achieve these targets.
Yes, Alden Meyer from E3G. Maybe just to build on Armi's question, we've seen analysis from the IEA saying it will take $3 or $4 trillion a year in mobilized finance to scale up renewables and clean energy storage and efficiency, et cetera, in developing countries to meet this goal. But we're having a big debate in these halls around just transition and the new Just Transition Work Program. And it's obviously going to take additional resources for workers, for communities, and for countries to manage the transition away from fossil fuels. And I'm wondering either if you did any analysis of that or if you have any information about the additional sums of money it's going to take to achieve that, I believe, 6% annual reduction in fossil fuel production. Because countries like Saudi Arabia and the next host of the COP, UAE, have plenty of resources themselves to finance their transition, but a country like Ecuador is currently increasing oil production to service unsustainable debt levels. They're going to need financial assistance to make this transition. Do you have any sense what the magnitude is on top of that? 3 to 4 trillion for scaling up renewables. What's the money needed to scale down fossil fuels?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, and it's not something that we've specifically done analysis on in this case. So that's something, yeah, I think for further work to look into. But I think one thing we noted was, yeah, we see these really promising scale-up rates globally, but when you look at the individual developing countries, for example, we're just not seeing the pace of change needed, and that's because I think there was one really worrying number coming out of IRENA recently that public climate finance to low-income countries has declined since the pandemic for clean energy. So yeah, I think it's a really important point that needs renewed focus. But one other point maybe related to this is the longer we delay the transition, the more disorderly it becomes as well. And there's a really clear need for governments to look into that longer term of what's needed for net zero and plan that accordingly. Otherwise, we could end up with increasing costs because of stranded assets, because of lock-in, because of governments being saddled with debt from fossil fuel projects that ultimately dry up when fossil fuel demand decreases.
Thais Galara from Canal de la Ciudad. I don't know if you include in the analysis something in focus about gas, because most of the country talk about phasing down or phasing out coal and oil, but from US to Argentina, they talk about gas as the resource for the transition. So I would like to know if there's anything on that regarding the future scenarios. Thank you.
So in our analysis, we're focusing on total fossil fuels, and we haven't done a dive into all of the individual fuels. We wanted to pull out coal because it's the most emissions intensive, but what our results do show is that there do need to be strong and sustained reductions in all fossil fuels, starting now and continuing out to reaching net zero. And so the narrative that gas can be a bridging fuel, that there can be growth in gas, we're very clear that that is not compatible with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees in a safe manner. And so, yeah, we do really need to counter that narrative that gas has, continued growth in gas is compatible with addressing the climate crisis.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, we actually released a report this time last year looking at gas phase out in the power sector. And showed that at global level and for different regions, and we showed that it really follows very soon after coal. So yeah, there's been a lot of emphasis on coal phase out, but gas phase out needs to happen about maybe 5 years afterwards, and globally we need to see it phased out by around 2040 or the early 2040s. So yeah, definitely a clear message that gas is not a transition fuel.
Any further questions?
Yeah, I was just looking at the report, and it seems that you ran the number to get to 1.5, and I'm not sure if you considered other parts of of a very complex system, such as critical minerals. For example, I know for EVs, there's going to be a very big demand on lithium and nickel and all sorts of metal. And even for renewable energy, scaling up renewable energy up to this point will require vast amount of mining and critical minerals, and processing those would be, I think, energy intensive. So did you do anything regarding analysis on the critical minerals required for the transition?
Yeah, thanks for your question. So this report doesn't specifically focus on the issue of the critical minerals that will be needed to drive the transition. And we know that that's going to be a key area where we need to ramp up investment and scale that economy. I think there are some promising signs. So the IEA in their latest State of Clean Manufacturing shows that the outlook for solar manufacturing capacity is actually very positive. And if those investments are made, then actually we'll be able to really ramp up solar deployment. So we know that that is an issue that needs to be addressed, and there's a lot of innovation going into finding new resources, thinking of how to introduce circular economy principles to get back minerals from solar panels or wind turbines which have been used. And there's also very good analysis that shows that the emissions impact of that mining, while not zero, is very small compared to the emissions impact of continued fossil fuel use. So while we need to be aware of this issue, and we absolutely need to do it to address it, it's no reason to delay the transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewables.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, as Neil said, I think it's really important that we look at energy efficiency and demand management in order to reduce the need for expansion of mining and critical minerals. There's also really promising developments in new battery technologies, for example, batteries that don't rely on lithium, for example. But one key point I'd like to make is that fossil fuel mining still dwarfs mining for critical minerals. And so I think we should not be using this, as you said, as a reason to delay the transition. We need to get out of fossil fuels as quickly as possible.
Hi, I have a question regarding the speed of updating the grid. How does it affect the speed of the energy transition?
Thanks for your question. Obviously grid infrastructure improvements are a really important component of supporting renewables deployment, particularly in the developing world. You know, we've talked earlier about the fact that renewables are really ready to drive the transition when you look at their costs and the exploding manufacturing base. But we know that that will only happen if we get the right enabling conditions, and those enabling conditions include climate finance, action to try and cut the cost of capital, and also action to improve grid infrastructure to enable those renewables to be deployed where they can then save money and reduce air pollution and bring a whole load of other benefits. So it's really important that we are addressing the issue of grid improvements as part of the enabling package for this renewables revolution.
And maybe I would just add to that, it's also going to be really important to think about climate impacts on our electricity system moving forward. Of course, the higher temperatures get, the more our grids are going to struggle with increasing demand for air conditioning, for example, but also with actually climate impacts on the grid infrastructure itself. So that's another part of the story to consider.
Hi. I have two questions. The first of all, if you call it the climate, or name it the climate crisis, why the developed countries don't speed up the process to move to the renewable energy? This one. The other one is, the other question is renewable energy really will reduce the global warming? Especially we know that the climate change are related to the natural causes?
Can I just take your name and affiliation, please?
Dr. Maghrabi from Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, so we know that the latest IPCC science has shown that global warming is very clearly correlated with human activity, and that's unequivocal. And we can see that with over 20% of global emissions coming from the power sector alone, that ramping up renewables deployment is going to make a significant cut to global emissions and therefore have a significant impact in limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Yeah, so our results are very clearly in line with taking the action that we need to limit warming to 1.5.
Any final questions? Yes.
Yeah, since no one else has taken the mic, I'll come in again. I'm wondering, when you unpack that 6% annual reduction in fossil fuel production, do you have any sense of the criteria that would determine where that reduction would happen? I mean, obviously, one factor is cost of production. So higher cost production presumably would be squeezed out first from the market. But there's also other metrics such as carbon intensity of the fuel. For example, the tar sands oil produced in Canada is much more carbon intensive than fuels produced in some other countries. And there may be some variations based on fugitive emissions from methane or other things related to natural gas. Do you have any sense, if you achieve that 6%, which countries or regions would see accelerated phase down versus ones that might stay in the market longer?
We haven't looked at that. We've just focused on the global level, really to keep the focus on global targets. I think that's something that we would like to explore further and really dive down into the regional level of what these reductions would mean. But yeah, of course, we would need to see both intensity improvements and strong fossil fuel reductions. Yeah, and what we do see is faster reductions in developed countries. We have selected pathways that show faster cuts in developed countries, given that these are the countries that need to move the fastest.
Yeah, and just building on that briefly, I really agree with your points that we need to think about a cost-effective phase-out, we need to think about emissions intensity, but as Claire's mentioning, we also need to think about an equitable fossil phase-out, and so that would also need to be a consideration in exactly how that global figure is broken down into regional action.
Thanks so much. My name is Alex Rafalovich from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. A really great report, and perhaps connected to this discussion is, will these targets or pathways be brought into your climate action tracker and used as part of the metrics for that, or what are your next steps as climate analytics for using these pathways and targets?
It's a great question. At the Climate Action Tracker, we really focus on looking at national level action. So we are actually, at the moment, developing some benchmarks at the national level, for example, for the power system, and those will be coming out later in the year. We also have our State of Climate Action report that will be coming out in the autumn, which looks at global benchmarks, including benchmarks similar to the ones we've looked at today, although these are new in addition to that. And that really tracks progress across a whole series of indicators to track system change. So yeah, look out for those.
Hello, Abdullah from Saudi Arabia. So you mentioned in one of your answers the IAA analysis, and I remember that one of their SDG scenario analysis, they are, which consider actually one of the SDG analysis that all accounting all the sustainable development goals, such as the affordable energy access. And they are projecting that 12% of low carbon technologies such as the CCS is expected to be within the portfolio of the energy mix. So do you think if that low carbon technology received the same funding as the renewable energy in the past, that it will help to achieve the climate goals, which is limiting the temperature rising of 1.5? Thank you.
Thanks for your question. If we look at the past performance and the past track record of different technologies which are being proposed for use in this transition, we see a really clear distinction between the track record of renewables and the track record of some other solutions which are being proposed, like CCS. So renewables deployment has exploded, and we've seen hugely falling costs, while CCS has still received huge amounts of public funding over the last decades, and yet around 80% of all projects which have been trialled have ended in failure. And so that's why in the latest pathways which take account of this evidence, we see such a key role for wind and solar and such a marginal role for carbon capture and storage in the power sector.
Yeah, and maybe just to add that I think you were talking about the IEA's sustainable development scenario, which is not compatible with the Paris Agreement. It still leads to very dangerous levels of warming. So we've really focused on those scenarios that limit warming to 1.5 and are compatible with the Paris Agreement. And yeah, maybe one other point is the IEA's analyses year on year have shown less and less reliance on carbon capture and storage as these clear trends in declining costs for renewables and no progress on CCS have become clear. So it's definitely not a technology that we can bet on for the future.
Lale Bechat from Canada. There's wildfire going on in Canada. Does your calculations include like an error margin for how much more reduction it has to be as the impact of these wildfires?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's tragic to see the climate impacts which are already ravaging communities around the world. I think our analysis is based on what the global pathways say is necessary to limit warming to 1.5 degrees with no or low overshoot. But we see already that 1.5 degrees is not a safe level of warming. We're already at dangerous levels of warming, and so the targets that we're putting forwards really should be seen as an ambition floor for the global community, and we should absolutely be making every effort where possible to accelerate action beyond them, because every 0.1 degree that we can save is huge climate harm that we can avoid.
Any final questions? One at the back.
Thanks, and I'm Helene van Soest from the Netherlands. And I do apologize for this not being a question, but I couldn't leave it unmentioned. Your outcome of limited role of fossil fuels with CCS seems to me to be a result of the selection of the scenarios. You start from scenarios in the first place that have limited CDR, so that is of course an obvious outcome then. Another remark I would have, I just looked at the report for a little bit and saw the selection of scenarios which is heavily biased towards basically one model, which makes up 2/3 of the scenarios. So if we were to base like global targets on this outcome, I think it would be better to actually look at a broader set of models and scenarios, because we know this model, for example, is heavily in favor always of renewables, which might be nice to look at, but not the full story. So I just wanted to leave that with you.
Yeah, maybe a clarification. Yeah, we limit reliance on carbon dioxide removal. We don't limit reliance on fossil fuels with CCS in our filtering. So that is an outcome of just the scenarios. It's not an outcome of our filtering. We treat any carbon capture used for carbon dioxide removal as in a separate box, and that's what we limit. So yeah, the fossil fuel with CCS limitation is really, really what these scenarios are showing. I don't know, maybe Neil, do you want to come in on the model range?
Yeah, and I guess one of the points we would make is that so the selection of scenarios that we use is still coming from 4 different global models. And so that's still, and within those models, there's still a diversity of scenarios that are trying to explore different questions. And so we would say that compared to some of the other sort of major global analyses, which are really useful, one of the strengths of our analysis is that it's based off a broader set of evidence than just one single scenario from a single model.
Okay, time's up now, so thank you so much for joining us today.